It all started on a warm Tuesday morning right after sunrise, the kind of morning where everything felt peaceful. The birds were chirping in harmony, the wind was soft and calm, and my loyal German Shepherd Duke was lying by the front door wagging his tail as he always did when he heard the neighborhood kids biking past the house. We had lived in this neighborhood for 6 years without a single problem. I bought the house after I returned from Afghanistan and started my job as an animal control officer for the city. I was proud of my career. I worked hard every day ensuring the safety of both animals and humans. Most of my neighbors respected me. They knew I was fair, honest, and didn't take nonsense from anyone. But every peaceful neighborhood has a problem. Ours was named Karen. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA. A woman with no chill and a clipboard so tightly glued to her hand it seemed like a natural extension of her body. She walked the streets with her sunglasses perched on her head and a smug expression that could curdle milk. Karen had always been nosy. She asked too many questions. She stood too long on sidewalks pretending to be looking at flowers when she was really staring into people's windows. She complained about lawns that were too wild, fences that were an inch too high, and wind chimes that were too cheerful. But I stayed off her radar. Until Duke started barking more than usual. It wasn't just barking, it was alert barking. Duke had military-grade training, and he didn't bark without a reason. There had been a string of break-ins in a neighboring suburb, and I had started to notice strange cars circling the area at night. I figured Duke sensed something off, and I wasn't about to tell him to stop doing his job. But Karen didn't care about context. She cared about rules. At exactly 7:05 a.m. on that Tuesday, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole, and there she was standing with her arms crossed and a rolled-up HOA newsletter in her hand. I opened the door, already half amused. "Karen," I said, leaning on the doorframe to appear casual. "Mr. Stone," she snapped without even a hello, "your dog has become a disruption to this community." I blinked. Duke stood behind me wagging his tail as if welcoming her. "You mean Duke?" I asked. "He barks sometimes, sure, but only when." "He barks too much," she interrupted sharply. She didn't even glance at Duke, and several neighbors have complained. "Several?" I asked. "Which ones?" "Names are confidential," she replied with a satisfied smirk. "Of course they are." She handed me a notice written in bold red font. It read, "First warning, animal disturbance. Failure to comply may result in daily fines and further enforcement." I looked up from the paper and said, "Karen, Duke is a working dog and a certified service animal. If he's barking, there's a reason. Maybe we should be asking why he's barking instead of trying to silence him." She scoffed. "I don't care what your dog is certified for. The HOA guidelines are clear. Quiet hours are from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., and even after that, persistent noise is a violation." I looked down at Duke, who gave a single bark at the sound of a squirrel nearby. Karen flinched. "See that?" "You mean that bark?" I said dryly. "The squirrel bark." "Don't get smart with me," she snapped. "This is your warning." And then she walked off with the sort of authority only someone with no actual power could possibly believe they possessed. That was the moment I knew something deeper was going on. Over the next few days, Duke barked more often, always in the early hours just before dawn. He paced the windows, tail stiff, ears alert. He was tracking something, someone. I decided to check our neighborhood surveillance footage. I had 3 cameras installed around my house, front door, backyard, and side gate. I reviewed the footage from the past week. There was, at 4:26 a.m., a man walking slowly by the side fence wearing a dark hoodie, carrying something long and thin. He stopped briefly near my trash bins, looked around, then walked off. Duke had barked that night and I had ignored it. I felt sick. At 4:42 a.m. the same man appeared on the backyard cam, only this time he was crouching low near the edge of my garden. The footage wasn't clear, but it looked like he was trying to peek inside the house. I sent the footage to my department. We ran a facial recognition check, but the guy was smart. He kept his face hidden the whole time. By Friday I had upgraded my security system, added motion sensor lights, and reinforced the backyard fence. Karen showed up again that morning, this time angrier. "Your dog is still barking," she shouted from the sidewalk, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Because someone's been creeping around my house at 4 in the morning, I said calmly. "But you don't care about that, do you?" She took a step closer. "I care about the rules, Mr. Stone, and your dog is violating them." "So you'd rather let a criminal wander around the neighborhood than let a trained animal do his job?" I asked. "Don't be dramatic," she said and waved a dismissive hand. That's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I was going to go on offense. I filed an official report with the city about suspicious activity. I started talking to neighbors, especially the ones Karen claimed had complained. Every single one of them said they hadn't filed anything about Duke. In fact, most of them said they felt safer knowing Duke was around. I confronted Karen with this. "You lied," I said, standing outside her home on Sunday morning. She opened her door with a smug look that quickly faded. "Excuse me," she said. "You said neighbors complained, but none of them did." "I don't have to explain anything to you," she said. "Actually," I said, "you do. See, I pulled your HOA record. Seems you've been filing anonymous complaints on behalf of the board without board approval. That's a violation of your charter." She froze. I'm not just a dog owner, I reminded her. I'm an animal control officer. I know every statute in the city's book, and now you're interfering with a certified service animal. You're risking federal fines. She stammered, that's ridiculous. No, I said, what's ridiculous is you thinking you can push people around with your fake authority. You have no badge, no training, and clearly no idea how dangerous it is to distract a working dog. That night I heard Duke barking again. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside. He was standing by the side gate barking ferociously. I turned on the floodlight and spotted movement. A figure was darting down the alley, but this time he wasn't fast enough. I had already called in backup. The man was caught a few blocks away carrying burglary tools and stolen mail. He had been casing houses for days, mine included. The story made the local paper. Retired veteran's dog helps catch serial burglar. Karen didn't come out of her house for 2 days. But on the 3rd day she left another notice on my door. Second warning, dog disturbance. That's when I smiled. Because the war wasn't over. It had just begun. And Karen was about to learn that messing with the wrong dog owner, especially one with a badge of his own, was the worst mistake she could make. And I had receipts. I had Tom. And I had Duke. We were just getting started. After Karen posted that second warning on my door, I sat on my porch sipping coffee with Duke at my feet and stared at the paper with a half smile. The arrogance of that woman after everything that just happened made my blood boil, but it also gave me clarity. She wasn't just power hungry, she was obsessed. Most people would back down after being proven wrong. After their actions led to the arrest of a prowler, most would take a step back and admit their mistake. Not Karen. She doubled down. And I wasn't going to let her keep writing fiction about my dog on fake complaint forms while pretending to represent an entire board of homeowners. So I began digging. First I went through the HOA bylaws. I knew the general rules, but now I read every line, every clause, every amendment. Over the past 10 years I marked anything that seemed odd, inconsistent, or recently changed. I highlighted the sections that required board approval for enforcement actions and the ones that outlined responsibilities for complaint validation. Turns out Karen had been acting without formal board approval for over a year. She filed over 20 anonymous complaints, half of them referencing her own property or the property of her best friend Cheryl, who lived 2 houses down. The records showed no meeting minutes, no approval signatures, and no transparency. That was strike 1. Next I requested city records through a Freedom of Information request, including her history of code enforcement interactions. Turns out she had filed over 100 non-HOA related complaints to city departments ranging from noise to tree height to illegal parking. Most of them were dismissed due to lack of evidence. Karen had a pattern, and it was public. That was strike 2. Strike 3 came from one of my neighbors, a retired civil engineer named Tom who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. Tom told me Karen had bullied the last HOA president into resigning, then took over unofficially because no one else wanted the job. She never held a formal election, never followed proper nomination procedures, and never filed official meeting notes with the city records office. She was running the HOA by fear and apathy. That was all I needed. I spent the next week preparing. Duke remained on alert, barking occasionally but mostly watching me print papers, write reports, and organize timelines. On Thursday I submitted a detailed complaint to the City Council, the county HOA regulatory body, and the district attorney's office with attached evidence of Karen's misuse of authority, harassment against a certified service animal, and fraudulent representation of the HOA board. I also delivered a personal copy to her doorstep in a neat envelope marked with her name. I didn't hear from her for 2 days. Then came the knock. It was Cheryl, Karen's closest friend and partner in gossip. She looked nervous. She asked if I had really filed the complaints. I said yes. She asked if I was going to press charges. I said maybe. Then she said something that made me pause. Karen is going through a tough time. She said she lost her husband last year and since then she hasn't been herself. I nodded silently. I could respect grief, but grief was not a free pass to harass neighbors. I said, Cheryl, your friend tried to criminalize a service dog in the middle of a burglary investigation. She falsified complaints and violated state guidelines. I don't care how lonely she is, that's not how we treat people. Cheryl left looking deflated. But I didn't feel bad. Because I knew something else. Karen had escalated things behind the scenes. My department contacted me the next morning. Apparently someone filed a report against me accusing me of animal neglect. They claimed Duke was being kept in unsafe conditions, deprived of proper care, and used for intimidation purposes. It didn't take long to trace the complaint back to an anonymous email account linked to Karen's IP address. She was now trying to use my own profession against me. Big mistake. My captain reviewed the footage, the vet records, the security system, the food logs, the behavior charts, and even interviewed 3 of my colleagues and 2 of my neighbors. Duke passed every test with flying colors. In fact, the report my captain wrote cleared me so thoroughly it ended up getting forwarded to the mayor's office as a model example of responsible pet ownership. Karen had just triggered a citywide review of HOA abuse cases. and I was now the face of that review. When I got the call from a local journalist asking to interview me for a human interest piece about the dangers of rogue HOA enforcement, I knew this story was going to grow. The article went live 2 days later with the headline, "Local Officers Loyal Dog Foils Crime Becomes Target of HOA Retaliation." It spread fast. Karen tried to deny everything. She held a small HOA meeting on her porch and tried to rally support, but only 2 people showed up: Cheryl and another woman who left 10 minutes in. The rest of the neighborhood was on my side. People started putting little signs in their yards with messages like "Bark on Duke" and "Let the dog work." It was the first time our community felt united. But Karen wasn't done. The next day she filed a noise violation through the city, this time including audio clips she claimed were Duke barking excessively between 2 and 3 a.m. When the city officers came to investigate, they quickly realized the audio was edited. The barking was looped with no background variation. When asked to provide the original file, she said she deleted it. Strike 4. That night someone egged my house. They hit the front door, the garage, and part of the mailbox. Duke barked once and sat beside the door growling low. I didn't even get mad. I filed a police report, gave them the footage, and installed 2 more cameras. The footage showed a familiar figure running down the street in a hoodie too small for their body, hunched over with an oddly feminine stride. The police paid Karen a visit that weekend. She wasn't arrested, but they gave her a stern warning. That same weekend, the HOA Oversight Committee responded to my formal complaint and launched a full audit of our neighborhood HOA. Karen was ordered to turn over all board records, all financial transactions, and all meeting documentation for the past 5 years. She panicked, because she didn't have any. What followed was a month of fallout. Karen lost her position on the HOA, the committee temporarily appointed a third party to oversee operations, and Cheryl resigned from her fake secretary role. The HOA account was found to have thousands in unaccounted for expenses, including home improvement purchases that just happened to match new installations on Karen's property. Fraud charges were discussed. And through it all, Duke sat by the porch like a king on his throne, occasionally barking when someone approached the mailbox. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because I knew Karen was wounded. And wounded animals are the most dangerous. She had lost control, lost reputation, and now she was looking for someone to blame. And I was still her target. The difference was now I had the entire neighborhood behind me. The city on my side. My badge in my wallet. And Duke at my feet. And I was ready for whatever came next. Because this war wasn't over. Not until Karen understood. That when you mess with a man's dog, you mess with everything he stands for. 2 months passed since the city started investigating the HOA and since Karen's position crumbled, but just because the storm had passed didn't mean the skies were clear. In fact, it felt like we were in the calm before something bigger. Karen had vanished from neighborhood meetings. She no longer walked the streets with her clipboard. She stopped waving to Cheryl across the yard, stopped talking to anyone really. She kept her blinds shut and only went outside when the trash needed taking out. But I knew she wasn't done. I knew she was plotting something. I saw it in the way her car was now parked on the far end of her driveway, like she expected company or needed a quick escape. I saw it in the new satellite dish she installed on her roof and the odd hours she'd leave the house, usually around midnight, only to return an hour later with groceries or packages. She wasn't rebuilding her life. She was building her next move. I kept busy at work. Our department had gotten more calls than usual about neighborhood pet issues. Some of them were real, others were just noise, but through it all I did my job and I kept Duke close. Duke sensed the tension too. He was more alert, more restless, barking less but watching more, like he was waiting for something. That something came on a Tuesday afternoon. I got home from work and found an envelope taped to my front door. No stamp, no return address, just my name typed in large font. Inside was a letter written in bold block letters printed from a computer. Read, "You think you won, but this isn't over. Your badge can't protect you from what's coming. Your dog won't always be there. Watch yourself." I stared at it for a while, then handed it to Duke as a joke. He sniffed it, growled, and then tore it in half. I filed the letter with the police. They took it seriously this time. Then I upgraded my security again: motion sensors, thermal cameras, a smart lock system with facial ID, everything. And I didn't sleep much that week. Then on Thursday Cheryl showed up at my door again. She looked pale, like she hadn't slept in days. I let her in and gave her some tea. Duke sat nearby, eyes fixed on her the whole time. She said Karen had been different ever since she lost her HOA position. Withdrawn, yes, but also desperate. She had applied for a job with a private security firm and had been rejected. She had started visiting conspiracy websites, forums about government overreach and personal freedom. She believed she was the victim now. And she had started blaming Duke for everything. I asked Cheryl if Karen still had access to HOA funds. She shook her head. Not officially. But that didn't mean she wasn't up to something. That night I stayed up watching the monitors 1-2-3 in the morning past. Then at 348 I saw something. A car parked 2 houses down. A man stepped out with something in his hand, a small object. He approached my mailbox and placed it inside. Then he walked away. I grabbed my flashlight and ran out, but the car was gone before I could get a plate. Inside the mailbox was another note. Read, "Dogs get lost all the time." The next morning I filed a restraining order against Karen. The police reviewed the footage again. They couldn't see the driver's face, but the build, the posture, the limp in the left leg, it was familiar. I submitted the clip to my department. They confirmed it matched the same gait from the prowler Duke had originally caught. Which meant Karen had either hired him or teamed up with him. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was criminal. I drove to City Hall that same afternoon and met with the oversight board. I brought every piece of evidence and demanded Karen be barred from any HOA-related activity for life. They agreed. But it didn't stop her. That weekend Duke disappeared. I woke up and he was gone. The gate was unlocked, the back door was slightly ajar, no signs of struggle, no blood, no fur, just empty space. I called his name, nothing. I checked the cameras. At 2:46 a.m. the system had glitched, the screen went black for exactly 90 seconds, then came back on with the gate swinging open and the backyard empty. They had cut the feed. I called every shelter, every vet, every rescue center in a 50-mile radius. I filed a missing animal report with my department. I put up posters, I knocked on doors. Nothing. Days passed, weeks. No sign of Duke. And that's when I broke. Because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was personal. And I was done playing nice. I started tailing Karen's car. I followed her to her late-night store runs, her coffee pickups, her silent trips to a warehouse on the edge of town. I rented a drone and flew it above the property. And I saw him. Duke. In the backyard, tied to a post, tail wagging weakly but alive. I took screenshots, GPS coordinates, and filed a report with the local police, but they said without a warrant they couldn't go in. So I pulled my badge. I used an old city ordinance allowing animal control officers to intervene in emergency situations involving suspected animal abuse or unlawful detainment. And I kicked down the gate. Duke barked once, then ran to me. I untied him, hugged him hard, and checked his body. No wounds, no injuries, just tired, underfed, and confused. That's when Karen appeared, screaming. She said I had no right, that I was trespassing, that I would be sued. I said nothing. I just showed her the letter she wrote, the footage of her hired help, and the picture of Duke on her property. Then the cops arrived. They didn't arrest her, not yet. But they issued a court summons and confiscated all electronics from the house. Karen was now under full investigation. The story exploded. Local news ran a segment titled, "HOA Nightmare Ends with Missing Dog Found in Former President's Backyard." Social media caught on. Duke became a symbol again, this time of justice. Karen was exposed, humiliated, and now faced legal action for animal kidnapping, trespassing, conspiracy, and evidence tampering. And I stood on my porch with Duke beside me, watching the street like nothing had changed. But everything had. Because now she knew I wouldn't back down. Now she knew the badge wasn't just for show. Now she knew that the man she tried to bully was someone who spent his life defending the innocent. And the dog she tried to silence had just brought down an entire false kingdom. But we weren't done yet. Because court was coming. And I was going to make sure this ended once and for all. The court date was set for the end of the month, and I spent every day leading up to it preparing my case while Karen paced inside her house, rarely seen outside anymore. I was working day and night, reviewing documents, organizing testimony, and walking Duke every morning like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Since the day I found Duke tied up in that backyard, I had seen a side of Karen that was no longer petty or annoying. It was dark and reckless and twisted by control. She had lost her power through the HOA, and she was trying to claw it back with threats and schemes and lies. I met with a prosecutor who was more than eager to take the case. Animal theft was one thing, but Karen had also crossed lines involving private surveillance, tampering with security footage, and submitting false complaints under city records. She had used the HOA as a weapon, and now she was going to be held accountable for it. The prosecutor told me she was aiming for felony charges and restitution. I said that was fine by me. The day before the hearing, Cheryl knocked on my door again, this time holding a folded blanket and a small box. I let her in. She looked like she had aged 10 years in 2 months. Her eyes were heavy and her posture slumped. She said she wasn't there to defend Karen anymore. She just wanted to give back what Karen had taken. Inside the box were all of Duke's tags, the ones he wore on his collar that had gone missing when he disappeared, his service badge, his military K-9 token, even a small chip reader. I asked her how she got them. She said Karen had them in a drawer marked HOA files. I thanked her and promised to mention her cooperation in court. Then I asked her the question I had avoided for months. Why did Karen hate Duke so much? Cheryl hesitated, then said Karen had always hated dogs. She was attacked as a child and never got over it, but what really pushed her over the edge was the attention Duke got in the neighborhood. When people stopped to say hi to Duke instead of Karen. When kids brought treats for Duke and not Karen. When Duke made headlines instead of her. She couldn't stand it. It wasn't about noise. It was about control and jealousy. That night I sat on the porch with Duke by my side watching the stars. And I knew exactly what I had to do. The courtroom was packed the next morning. Neighbors filled the benches. The city reporter sat in the back with her notepad, and a new HOA board member who had recently replaced Karen took notes with quiet satisfaction. Karen entered wearing all black like she was attending a funeral. Her face was pale, her mouth tight. She sat behind her lawyer, a man who looked far too tired for someone defending a woman accused of stealing a dog. The judge entered the room and the trial began. The prosecution laid everything out. The fake complaints, the harassment, the falsified evidence, the threats, the kidnapping of a registered service dog, the sabotage of security systems, the use of a known prowler to assist in unlawful entry. It was methodical and brutal. I took the stand last. I told the story from the beginning, how Duke barked at odd hours because of danger, how Karen twisted those moments into accusations, how she refused to back down even after a criminal was caught, how she escalated into full-blown retaliation. I explained what it meant to serve as an animal control officer, how Duke was more than a pet, how he had saved lives and earned his place in our home and in our city. Then I showed the jury photos. Duke in uniform during patrol. Duke with kids from the school safety program. Duke standing proudly next to a senior citizen he helped comfort after a traumatic incident. The courtroom was silent. Karen did not testify. Her lawyer argued that she had mental strain, that her judgment was impaired, and that she meant no actual harm. But the jury saw the pattern. The cold strategy. The months of torment. The cruelty. When the verdict came in guilty on all charges, the room stayed silent for a moment, then slowly neighbors began nodding quietly. Justice felt quiet that day. But it was real. The judge sentenced Karen to probation, community service, a restraining order, and mandatory psychological counseling. She was also ordered to pay fines and damages, including vet bills and emotional distress compensation. She left the courtroom in silence, her head down. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Duke. I didn't celebrate. I just walked Duke out of the building into the sunlight. He barked once, and I smiled. But our story didn't end there. A few days later, I was invited to speak at a local HOA oversight summit hosted by the mayor's office. They wanted someone who had lived through abuse of power, someone who could help reform policies and protect homeowners from rogue board members. I agreed. At the summit, I told them everything, not just about Karen but about the system that allowed her to thrive. The lack of accountability. The fake elections. The unchecked complaints. The silence of neighbors who were too afraid to speak. I proposed reforms. Transparency laws. Mandatory board training. Quarterly reviews from city officials. Anonymous complaint bans unless verified with physical evidence. The crowd applauded. And when the mayor handed me a certificate of recognition for community bravery, I asked if Duke could come up too. He got a bigger cheer than I did. Back in the neighborhood, things started to change. The new HOA board held a proper election. People started talking to each other again. Yards were less judged and more appreciated. Kids played louder without fear of citations. And Duke became something of a local celebrity. People left treats on our porch. He got a custom-made badge with his name engraved. Even the local bakery made dog biscuits named after him. But most importantly, he was free. Free to bark. Free to protect. Free to live without someone trying to silence him for their own ego. As for Karen, her house went up for sale 3 months later. No one bought it. Eventually the city repossessed it for unpaid fines. It was poetic. The house of silence reclaimed by the law. Sometimes I still sit on the porch at sunset, Duke beside me watching the street with those alert eyes of his. And I remember the months of chaos. The tension. The fear. The fight. And I know one thing for sure. You can take away a title. You can strip someone of fake power. But you can't bully truth. You can't silence loyalty. And you damn sure can't break the bond between a man and his dog. Karen tried. And she failed. Because Duke wasn't just my dog. He was justice on 4 legs. And together we reminded everyone in that neighborhood that some rules are meant to protect. And some people are meant to be stopped. It had been 6 months since the trial, since Karen left the neighborhood, since Duke returned home. But in a strange way it all still felt fresh. Not because I was haunted by what happened, but because the entire neighborhood had changed, and in many ways for the better. People who had once stayed quiet started speaking up. Kids played more freely in their front yards. Elderly couples walked hand in hand without looking over their shoulders, worried about Karen writing them up for something ridiculous. And me, I was no longer just the animal control officer down the street. I had become something else. An example. A story that parents told their children when they asked why Duke was allowed to bark. A reminder that when one person stands up, others will follow. And Duke was thriving. He gained back the weight he had lost during his captivity, and his spirit seemed stronger than ever. He still sat on the porch every evening watching the world with calm, alert eyes like a guardian. But despite the peace, I still kept the cameras running. I still checked the locks twice. And I still watched the street with a small lingering suspicion. Because sometimes people like Karen do not just disappear. Sometimes they regroup. It was a Saturday morning when I got the letter. Not hand-delivered. This one was mailed from another city. No return address. No signature. Just a short typed message. You may have won this time. But this isn't over. I stared at it for a long time, then fed it to the shredder and let Duke tear up the pieces on the porch. He barked once, then lay down beside the front step, his tail thumping lightly. If Karen was still out there, still bitter, still looking for another way to lash out, I wasn't afraid. Because I had learned something important. I had learned that resilience beats power every time. The new HOA board ran smoothly now. They made sure every decision was transparent, every rule enforced with fairness and logic, not bias or vendettas. They even started a community program called Watchdogs of the Neighborhood, where people volunteered to look out for one another, not spy or report or harass, but genuinely care. Duke was made honorary mascot. At the first community cookout since the HOA was restructured, a big banner hung across the park entrance. Read, "Welcome to a community that barks back." The mayor showed up with his dog too, a goofy Labrador who slobbered on everyone. People laughed, shared food, and played music. Someone handed me a microphone and asked if I wanted to say something. I looked out at the crowd, then down at Duke. He tilted his head, waiting. So I stepped up and said, "I just want to thank all of you for standing up when it mattered most, for reminding me that this neighborhood is more than a set of fences or lawns or paint colors. It's about people. It's about respect. And sometimes it's about a dog who refuses to be silenced." The crowd clapped and someone yelled Duke for mayor, and people actually cheered. He barked like he knew what was going on. I thought maybe this was the end of the story. But it wasn't. Because a few weeks later, a citywide conference on HOA abuse reform was announced, and I was invited to be the keynote speaker. They wanted me to share the story. Not just the details, but the lesson. How power in the wrong hands turns into tyranny. How silence can be mistaken for approval. How one person standing up can change everything. And how loyalty sometimes has four legs and a bark that saves lives. At the conference, I spoke to a full room of city officials, law students, community activists, and even a few HOA board members who had flown in from other counties. I walked them through every step. The fake complaints. The manipulated reports. The disappearance of Duke. The trial. The reform. They listened closely. And when I finished, there was a moment of silence, then a standing ovation. Not for me. For Duke. Later that day, someone asked me if I'd ever thought about running for office, maybe leading a neighborhood council or even a seat on the city board. I laughed and said I already have the best partner in public service, and he doesn't wear a tie. We returned home that night exhausted but proud. Duke got a new bed made of memory foam donated by a supporter from the conference. He didn't care about the fancy padding, he just cared that he was home. And so did I. But deep down I knew Karen might still be out there plotting, nursing her grudge. And that was okay. Because I would always be ready. I had learned to never underestimate quiet threats. I had learned to read between the lines. I had learned that being right does not always make you safe. But most importantly, I had learned to fight with patience, to stand with evidence, and to never ever let someone steal your peace with a clipboard and a bad attitude. Months turned into a year. Then one day a letter arrived again. But this time it wasn't a threat. It was from a community on the other side of the state. They had heard my story and were fighting a similar battle with an HOA leader gone rogue. They asked for advice. I sent them everything. Documents, strategies, recordings, redacted templates, and a note. Your community is worth protecting. Your voice matters. Stand firm. And let your watchdogs bark. Weeks later they won. Their HOA leader resigned. Their bylaws were rewritten. Their town council passed new ordinances. They sent me a photo of a banner they hung at their town hall. Read, "Thank you, Duke." And just like that, the story spread beyond our little neighborhood. What started with a barking dog and a bitter woman turned into a movement. And Duke, he didn't care about the headlines or the speeches or the awards, he just wanted his evening walks and his treats and the people he loved safe around him. Sometimes I look at him and think about everything we went through. Every false report. Every sleepless night. Every silent battle fought behind fences and front doors. And I know that in a world full of Karens, what we need most are more Dukes. Because loyalty is louder than fear. Truth is stronger than lies. And the bond between man and dog is a force that no HOA can break. Not today. Not ever. If you think Karen's story ends here, think again. We've got more shocking HOA drama coming your way. Like, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the truth behind the rules. This is HOA Confidential, where the real stories begin.